ジャケットにポケットはありますね。はい。はい。
ここにはない。スカートにかけてあります。
スカートない。どうしたらいいですか？
じゃあ手
に持つか、こっち入れたらいいですか？
そうですね。
はいはいはいはい、すみません。はいはいはいはいはい。私が一番向こうです。手前ですよね。はいはい。そうですよね。はい。
Good evening. Welcome to Japan Society. I am Moto Sakurai, President of the Society. I am very pleased to welcome you to the discussion with General David Petraeus and General Koichi Isobe. They will be discussing the geopolitical landscape in Asia and the prospects for U.S. Japan security cooperation. Before we begin, we'd like to thank each of the sponsors that make these business and policy programs possible. Global leaders, Citi, Deloitte, and United Airlines, and corporate partners, Mizuho Financial Group and Toyota Motor North America. Now it is my pleasure to introduce today's moderator, Professor Takako Hikotani. Professor Hikotani is a George Curtis Associate Professor of Modern Japanese Politics and Foreign Policy at Columbia University. Her research focuses on Japanese foreign policy and Japanese domestic politics. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Professor Hikotani-san.
Thank you very much, President Sakurai, for the kind introduction. Good evening. Thank you very much for coming to this event today. We are very happy to welcome the two generals from Japan and United States, General David Petraeus and General Koichi Isobe, for the important topic of the changing geopolitical landscape in Asia, U.S. Japan alliance today. And just for some logistical matter that I'd like to ask you for your cooperation is that we have distributed the question sheets to you. We will be collecting that at around a little bit past 7 p.m. So if you have a question, the discussion will be until 7:30. So we have to ask you to come up with questions relatively early. But if you can hand over the staff your question sheets, I'll be looking at them here and asking the questions to the two generals on your behalf. So please, we'd like to ask for cooperation in handling the Q&A in that matter. And so please start thinking about questions as you listen. But without further ado, I think I should first start with introducing the two generals on stage today. I think this is a very interesting and important and different event than the type of event on U.S.-Japan relations that we tend to have, that we have two Army generals on stage. I think U.S.-Japan alliance tend to be spoken about more in terms of the naval relationship. I think that tends to be the focus, but I think it's actually very unusual to have the Army general and the Ground Self-Defense Force general, and also just the fact to have two former uniformed generals on stage for this kind of matter is kind of unusual too. So I like to ask them to introduce themselves, but I do have a list of their accomplishments that I have to go through, so I think I like to do a lot of that on their behalf. So General David Petraeus is one of the most prominent U.S. military figures of the post-9/11 era and has been described as one of the great battle captains in U.S. military history. Following his military service, he served as the director of CIA and is now a partner with the global investment firm KKR and chairman of the KKR Global Institute. During his 37-year career in the U.S. Army, General Petraeus was widely recognized for his oversight of the organization that produced the U.S. Army's counterinsurgency manual and overhauled all aspects of preparing leaders and units for deployment to combat, and for his leadership in the surge in Iraq, and for his command of coalition forces in Afghanistan. He culminated his military career with 6 consecutive commands as general officer, 5 of which were in combat, a record believed unmatched in the post-World War II era. General Petraeus is a graduate with distinction from the U.S. Military Academy and a top graduate of his Command and General Staff College class. And General Petraeus also earned a PhD in an interdisciplinary program of international relations and economics from Princeton University's Whitlow Wilson School. He taught economics and international relations at the United States Military Academy, and after leaving government, he was visiting professor of public policy for 3.5 years at the City University of New York's Macaulay Honors College. He is also a member of the board of Optiv, a global provider of cybersecurity services, a Judge Whitney Professor at the University of Southern California, and a senior fellow at Harvard University's Belfer Center. General Petraeus has been awarded numerous U.S. military, State Department, NATO, and United Nations medals, including 4 awards of the Defense Distinguished Service Medal, the Bronze Star Medal for Valor, the Combat Action Badge, the Ranger Tab, and Master Parachutist Wings. He has also been decorated by 13 foreign countries, and I was going to ask, does that include Japan or not yet?
Sadly, no.
So not yet then.
Now that you mention it, thank you so much.
So let me now turn to General Koichi Isobe.
I'm available, though.
Okay, I think somebody might take note of that. General Isobe retired from active duty in August 2015 after 35 years of service in the Japan Self-Defense Force. He currently serves as strategic advisor to Kawasaki Heavy Industries, and he also serves as senior fellows of Harvard University Asian Center and Asia Pacific Initiative Foundation, and currently resides in Massachusetts. He was Commander Eastern Army in his final 2 years of service. Eastern Army's area of responsibility covers the Tokyo metropolitan government and 10 prefectures and almost half of the Japanese total population and GDP. During his tenure, he deployed more than 100,000 self-defense force personnel in 3 big disasters: October 2013's typhoon flood landslide in Izu Oshima Island, February 2014 record-breaking snowfall in the Kanto region, and September 2014's volcanic eruption at Mount Ontake. So as you know, Japan has lots of natural disasters. Unique among ground self-defense force general officers, General Isobe experienced joint staff senior positions twice, director of J5 and vice chief of staff. He served as a linchpin of U.S. Japan military coordination via Operation Tomodachi during the Great East Japan earthquake of March 2011 while serving as J5. And for those of you who's not familiar with the military jargon, what is J5? Is that Joint Staff J5 proposes strategies, plans, and policy recommendations to the Chief of Staff to the Joint Staff to support his provision of best military advice to the Prime Minister. So that means that his role was very important.
It means he's very smart, actually. That's where all the smart guys go.
Oh, that's where all the smart goes. Thank you for the... So, and as Vice Chief of Chief Joint Staff, he initiated amphibious warfare study forum among the Self-Defense Force 3 service senior leaders. General Isobe was born in 1958 in Korea City, Hiroshima Prefecture, and was raised in Tokushima Prefecture. He attended the National Defense Academy and was commissioned as a second lieutenant of the Ground Self-Defense Force in 1981. He was a helicopter aviator who flew OH-6 and CH-47. After graduation from Command and General Staff College Ground Self-Defense Forces, he served at Japan-U.S. Security Affairs Division at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. And he also served at various staff appointments in the General Staff Office, GSDF. His command positions included 9th Division Aviation Squadron and 7th Armored Division and Eastern Army. General Isobe earned Master's of Military Studies at U.S. Marine Corps University, one thing that I'd like to ask you to highlight later, why it's the Marine Corps. And where his master's paper on the modality of the U.S. Japan alliance earned the Brigadier A.W. Hammett Award. He also received his Master's of Science in a National Resource Strategy at the National Defense University, Fort McNair in 2003. General Isobe's awards include the Legion of Merit and the Meritorious Service Medal.
Those are both U.S. awards.
U.S. awards, so things should be reciprocal.
No, it's actually a pretty big deal again.
Okay, thank you. So please allow me to add a word and to highlight the aspects of their career that means most to me personally, their profiles as soldier scholars. Previous to my appointment at Columbia University, I taught for 18 years at the National Defense Academy in Japan. And during that time, I taught classes on civil military relations and U.S. foreign policy, and referred to General Petraeus as an example of soldier scholar. So you can imagine how nervous I am sitting next to him right now. It's almost surreal that I'm meeting him in person. And another officer I frequently refer to as an example of soldier scholar was General Isobe, a graduate of the academy whom I had the privilege of knowing for almost 20 years. Alongside his studies at the USMC University at the National Defense Academy, General Isobe has written important forward-looking articles on the Self-Defense Force roles and missions, including when he was still captain at the Command and Staff General College. And not all my former students follow my advice to become a soldier scholar like the two generals here, but there's one soldier scholar in the making that I'm happy to introduce you today. I'm putting on the spot, but Major Hoshino, who is sitting right there, he's currently an exchange officer, foreign exchange officer and instructor at the U.S. Military Academy at West Point.
Fantastic.
And I like to emphasize that point because, well, one, I'm terribly proud of him right now, and also I think it shows the level of trust there is between the U.S. and Japan. They would actually have a foreign officer from Japan to train and teach the cadets at your academy. So just for that, I'd like to highlight that. And
Thank you.
sorry for going on for so long. Now I'd like to turn to General Petraeus, and I think I'd like to start with what have you done in relationship with Japan, either during your career in the Army, and also now I understand that Ambassador Reiichiro Takahashi, who a lot of us know from his 3 years as Consul General in New York, you worked with him in Afghanistan.
I did. He was a terrific partner in Afghanistan. And really, the reason I spent so much time with him then, and by the way, when I was in New York during this time as the Consul General, was because Japan was the #2 contributor when it came to financial support for Afghanistan, a country that desperately needed and still needs all the support it could get. And one that, unlike Iraq, which could generate $100 billion in oil revenue as long as the pipelines weren't blown up, it could not do that. And it very, very much depended on that assistance. And Japan, together with the U.S., really led the way in that regard. And he was a terrific partner. I should note that in Iraq, I also had a close partnership with the Japanese diplomatic corps there. Some of you may recall, tragically, that 2 Japanese diplomats were killed on a road north of Baghdad fairly early on. And this is when I was a 2-star general in northern Iraq with our headquarters in Mosul, and they were driving up to meet me. And every time I go back to Japan and go to the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, which is just about every time I go back, I always take time to pause and to visit a tree that's been planted in their honor that is very unobtrusive, a very small little marker. But those 2 individuals gave their lives for what it was that our 2 countries were seeking to do together in a very troubled part of the world. I should also note, I really do feel privileged to be here with you this evening. The reason I am here, candidly, is because of the admiration that I've had for your country. In my post-government time, during my now coming up on 6 years with KKR, that's 3 times as long as any job I ever held in the military or at the CIA, we have done a great deal in Japan. We have a very active office there. We plan to deploy some $3 billion of the $9.3 billion that we raised a year or so ago in the largest Asia investment fund in history, and we did the same with the previous fund as well. We have very close relations there. As I mentioned to you backstage, I always visit with the various leaders, the National Security Advisor, the Foreign Minister, the Defense Minister, if they're not changing quite as constantly as they did for a while. Periodically, the Prime Minister and also the Chief Cabinet Secretary, for whom I know your husband worked as well, which is a great way for a political scientist to get insights into how government operates. I have always had an enormous, again, as I mentioned earlier, admiration for Japan. There is something that is very, very special about it. Nothing captures it better than the description that I heard from a very close friend who said that Japan is a country in which if something is worth doing, it's worth doing perfectly. And that really, I think, does capture the situation there. I also am delighted to be here in a somewhat non-standard panel, as you noted, 2 retired generals. In fact, I was talking to my wife on the way over here, and she mentioned that, yes, she had been to the Japan Society, and it was when they had an art exhibit on cats in Japanese art. So you couldn't find a more different event than this one right here. Again, Japan is a country, I think, that it's accurate to say that punches way above its weight class in a number of different arenas. Certainly that would be when it comes to a variety of diplomatic activities, to financial assistance, and a variety of humanitarian assistance donations that it makes with very, very high quality diplomats, military, and other government officials. And again, it has been a real joy to have quite a bit of interaction with them as, again, when I was in uniform, when I was at the CIA, now at KKR, and even in some of the academic endeavors. As I mentioned, one of the last times I was there, it was as a professor at USC, University of Southern California, which has a very, very close partnership with institutions in Japan. So again, a privilege to be here, and thanks to all of you for turning out on a brisk evening here in New York. And I'm glad that we are supposedly, it's a sellout,
Yes.
not that I'm competitive or anything, but
So
if it's worth doing, it's
Of
worth
course.
doing perfectly.
Yes, it's worth doing perfectly. And General Isobe, it's already clear from my introduction that your career has intersected in many
Yes.
ways with the U.S., but would you please elaborate
Yes.
on experience here?
Thank you, Hikutani-sensei, and thank you, Japan Society, for inviting me this prestigious occasion. And let me begin with introducing you about the relation between the Japan Ground Defense Force and General Petraeus. After 2 years of the 9/11, Japanese Prime Minister Junichiro Koizumi decided to send a ground self-defense force contingent to Iraq for humanitarian assistance mission. At that time, I was a director of the Policy and Programs Division at the Ground Staff Office. It's a headquarters of the Ground Self-Defense Force. And the General Petraeus was the commanding general at that time of the multinational security control.
Transition Command Iraq,
Yeah.
that was the 3-star command,
Yes.
which was essentially the train and equip mission.
Yes.
It was a massive mission, involved over $10 billion, I think, in just 1 year alone. But again, a very, very significant undertaking, trying to rebuild all of the Ministry of Defense and Ministry of Interior forces of all types, which would ultimately total nearly a million individuals.
And at that time, my colleague went to Iraq to meet you. And at that time, you committed the tremendous support to the Japanese Ground Self-Defense Force. So actually, in this occasion, I'd like to extend my sincere appreciation to you, what you have done during the Iraqi operation.
Well, again, the appreciation was ours, truly. Japan had a lot of reasons and that it could have hid behind and said, well, we'd really like to help, but sorry, our Constitution or our this or our that. And that was never the case.
Yes.
And we're very grateful to you for that.
And after that, in Japan, 2011, we had a very huge tragedy, March 11th earthquake in Eastern Japan. At that time, I was on a director J5, Joint Staff. So at that time, the U.S. Pacific Commander, Admiral Willard, he initiated the Operation Tomodachi. And it's a robust support to the Japan. And also we have triple disasters, tsunami, earthquake, and the Fukushima nuclear disasters. So both forces decided to establish a robust coordination mechanism in Tokyo, Japan. So the exercise, the operation conducted very successfully. So this is the Operation Tomodachi. And one of the research theme in Harvard is the Operation Tomodachi and the U.S. Japan coordination mechanism. I'd like to explore how the modality of the U.S. Japan, the coordination mechanisms should be. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
You know, the key to that, candidly, was just the nature of the relationship, number one. Second, the nature of the relationship between the two presidents, the president and the prime minister.
Yes.
And third, a very rapid decision in Washington, which is not always known for rapid decisions. But if you get the big idea right, as in that case, which is we are going to help, and you military and state and Agency for International Development and all the others, you figure out how to do that. That's pretty important. You know, it brings to mind a little bit George H.W. Bush stating when he was briefed by his advisors on the Iraqi invasion of Kuwait, and he merely said, "This will not stand." And everybody said, "Oh, okay, I got it." And by the way, there'd been a lot of debate. Not everybody in uniform by any means wanted to actually deploy and deal with this. So again, getting the big idea right, getting the guidance right from the very, very top sure can cut through a lot, as you know, in practice, and as you know, as a scholar of civil-military relations.
Thank you. We'll get back to the alliance issue, but first I need to widen the
Sure.
topic a little bit and talk about the current state of geopolitical landscape in Asia. And I'd like to flip the order and ask General Isobe first. I think you all have this PowerPoint page
Yes.
with you, and so would you start explain using
Yes, thank you. I think that General Petraeus would introduce his views very broadly. So I would like to focus on the Northeast Asia surrounding Japan's situation. So I think Japan has three challenges right now. One is a traditional geopolitical challenge. Second is a new emerging challenge. And the third is recurring challenge. Please look at the first slide. The most prominent feature of Japan's geography is that Japan occupies a 2,200-mile arc-shaped island chain off the east coast of the Eurasian continent. The Japanese archipelago is strategically situated in the position that controls exits toward the Pacific Ocean from the continental powers. Based on this geostrategic feature, historically, Japan has always paid attention to three strategic fronts: the North, the Korean Peninsula, and the Southwestern Islands. Since the Meiji Restoration, Japan's strategy has focused on one strategic front, while others are holding. Japan has been interacting with neighboring countries using a bilateral relationship. However, since the 2010s, all three fronts have become increasingly tense simultaneously. Japan has never experienced such a situation before. On the other hand, in the US, the 2017 US National Security Strategy describes 4 countries as revisionist powers or rogue states: China, Russia, North Korea, and Iran. Uniquely among the hotspots of the world, 3 of those exist in Northeast Asia. And those 3 countries are Japan's neighbors. The drastic geostrategic change in this region is occurring in conjunction with economic development. Japan has been facing challenges and provocations from those countries simultaneously. This is the first recognition of the regional security environment, namely traditional geopolitics, has come back in the region. And the second slide shows that the new emerging threats like non-traditional domains like cyberspace and outer space. These threats have specific features: invisible, borderless, instance, grave impact on daily social life. The Japanese government's cyber security strategy notes, quote, serious impacts may occur not only for governmental bodies and critical infrastructure operators, but for other businesses and even individuals, unquote. And the third challenge is the recurring challenge: diverse natural disasters such as heavy rainfall, typhoons, earthquakes, tsunami, volcanic eruptions. Statistics show that 20% of worldwide earthquakes with 6.0 Richter or above occur in Japan, and 7% of active volcanoes of the world exist in Japan. Response to these natural disasters is one of the major roles of the self-defense force. And the third slide, this is the recognition of the people in Japan in the backside. The latest public opinion survey of 2011 marks the highest 86 point, which means 86% of the respondents thinks that Japan might be involved in an armed conflict in the future. During the 20th century, such concern had been around 50, but has gradually increased to 80% or more in the 21st century. Okay, so this is my overview.
Thank you. So, General Petraeus, it seems like, as General Isobe mentioned, we've entered or re-entered era of great power competition, and quite obviously, for the region, China is a defining issue. So, are we destined for war, as Graham Allison's book title suggests, and is the game totally over? That is there no chance to engage China to be active member of rules-based international order? There seems to be, being up at Columbia too, that there is much more pessimism than anything else about China. What is your view about the future of great power competition, especially with regards to China?
Well, having had Graham Allison as my mentor at Harvard, where I'm a senior fellow, have been for some 6 years now or so, an enormous admiration for him, and interviewed him on the stage of the 92nd Street Y on his book, which is titled Destined for War, as you said, with no question mark, can China and the United States avoid the Thucydides trap, which is a description of using Thucydides' history of the Peloponnesian War, where he talks about Sparta as the established power, i.e. U.S., Athens is a rising power, China, and he writes, inevitably they went to war. And clearly, look, it cannot be inevitably that they go to war because we are in a nuclear age. Even though some, very recently, Bob Kaplan, who wrote about the, quote, new Cold War in foreign policy in the last week or so, identified a whole variety of ways that you can go to war without really threatening, I think, the nuclear threshold. Cyberspace is certainly among those. Look, I think, first of all, to back up and just ask, how would you describe the overarching situation in East Asia and really in now what is termed the Indo-Pacific region, which is a good, very good title, I think. And by the way, having been in India last week, I can tell you that it is, I think, very, very apt, because the importance of India in this region overall is becoming greater and greater. But as a general statement up front, I think it's very accurate to say that the situation in East Asia is increasingly complex and increasingly challenging. The single biggest development is obviously the rise of China. And let me just state right now, by the way, that I am one who hopes that China and the United States can establish a mutually beneficial relationship, one that is advantageous to both sides. It's not a zero-sum game constantly, although there will always be aspects of competition in which clearly there will be winners and there will be losers. But one hopes that there can be the kind of strategic dialogue that can indeed avoid the Thucydides trap, that can avoid a situation where there seems to be a destination that is war. And I was just in China for a week in mid-December, and I have enormous admiration for what China has done. Indeed, no country in history has ever achieved what they did in the 40-year period that they are now celebrating since Deng Xiaoping welcomed the world to China, opened China to the world, and which is now actually captured, as only Chinese can do, in an industrial strength fashion in their national museum, which has been completely redone to show the 40 years of progress. And it is frankly quite breathtaking. Indeed, there's a period in there of 20 years where they had year-on-year double-digit GDP growth, with maybe one exception in that 20-year period. This is, again, completely unprecedented. And I would contend that there is not just a geopolitical competition that is going on between the United States and China, again, one which I hope can be mutually beneficial. It's even bigger than that. This is a true political economic competition, because just as, in a sense, we competed with the Soviet Union, the democracies of the world, the free market economics against the Soviet Communist Party and command economy, and as was captured in an article that then became a book, The End of History, in 1989 by Francis Fukuyama. He predicted that the Soviet Union would collapse of its own weight. It did. He became famous. The little journal that he wrote in, National Interest, which had only 10,000 subscribers at the time. I was one. I was in an academic phase in grad school. Got a huge boost. And by the way, I am now working on a project again at Harvard that is titled The Return of History. Because again, this is not just about, again, traditional great power rivalries. This is about systems. And by the way, their system's doing pretty darn well at a time when the democracies of the world are almost all, with one major exception, Japan, beset by populism, sometimes ultranationalism, and a variety of forces that are causing huge challenges. You look at the UK with Brexit, France with the yellow vests, Italy with a right-wing, left-wing government that only agrees on one thing, no more refugees. Germany, whose chancellor by all rights should have breezed to victory, had a very close call and was only very narrowly able to put together a coalition to retain her job, despite the country doing magnificently in every regard, except for her decision to take in 1 million refugees, Spain with a minority government, et cetera. And the U.S. with, again, a degree of populism in our own country as well. So that's the overarching strategic situation in which Japan finds itself. And Japan, of course, has this unique situation that the U.S. has as well, where their biggest geopolitical rival, clearly China, is also at least one of the biggest, if not their biggest, trading partner. And of course, the same is true of the United States, something that certainly wasn't the case when the U.S. was engaged in a Cold War with the Soviet Union. Now, beyond that, though, of course, there are a variety of other challenges. North Korea is developing nuclear and missile capabilities. I was actually in Japan the first time a missile sailed over the island to the north. It was quite a big deal. All my meetings for that day got rescheduled, needless to say. And of course, there are disputes that continue, unfortunately, because we would, the U.S. in particular would love to see our two allies in Northeast Asia, South Korea and Japan, reconcile and work together and share intelligence and all the rest of this, instead of prolonged squabbling and differences over situations some 70 years ago. And then, of course, there's a dispute with Russia over who owns the islands and so forth. So again, there are a number of challenges, and I think it's very important also, just again to be forthright and to acknowledge as well that there's one other challenge that Japan has to deal with, which is a demographic downturn that some have actually titled a demographic death spiral. And this is a big deal. On the one hand, of course, policies have enabled Japan to stay relatively homogeneous, although there is now some acknowledgement that they're going to have to allow people to come in from the outside. But this is a very, very significant issue because, of course, the foundation of all national power starts with the economic base. And it's very, very difficult if your working force is shrinking. By the way, China is losing 5 million people out of their workforce every year, but Japan is already losing people out of its overall population. It's the one country in the world where the rise of the robots will really be welcomed. And they'll be happy to have people displaced by robots so that they can go do other things that only people can do. But this is the very complex, I think, environment in which China finds itself. And that's before digging into some of the other issues that the General alluded to, again, in cyberspace, the issues of some of the other countries in the region that are rising powers, if you will, as well, the shifts of different economic forces that are all brought to bear there in East Asia. And I think it calls for very, very careful and thoughtful and, bright J5s of the world and others. And I should note, just perhaps when closing on this segment, that those in the U.S. who are very attuned to this kind of stuff are very appreciative of China of Japan reinterpreting its constitution to allow true actions that an ally should, if you're together and your other ally is shot at, that you could actually return on behalf of that ally. That is not a trivial issue for those of us who have served in uniform.
Thank you. So General Isobe, what about Japan and the challenge from China, which is very multifaceted?
Yes.
And it's often said that Japan has a very good friend in the U.S., who's relatively far, but you can't really move right out of the region, having been next to China. I think your map that you've distributed shows where Japan is positioned and what Japan has to deal with geographically. But it's not just that. There's all the other type of challenges. It's very different from the traditional Montreal challenge. So how has Japan been dealing with this challenge or the geopolitical challenge, and what aspect of it is in relationship with the U.S.-Japan alliance that you see has been happening in the past couple of years?
Yes, when I first read through the U.S. National Security Strategy of 2017 December released, and I was astonished that the strategy clearly describes China as a revisionist power. I think this is the first time for the U.S. security strategy to describe China as a revisionist power. So I think
quite a forthright admission, I think, actually.
Yes.
But I think it also reflected not just this administration, not just that party, but I think a bipartisan
Yes.
recognition that some of the hopeful assumptions that we had about the rise of China would have not actually materialized. And that is, again, a very, very big deal
Yes.
in the biggest relationship in the world.
And Hikotani-sensei mentioned that Japan is situated in a very strategic important position. The shield for the U.S. security, Japanese location is like a shield to stop the advancement of the continental powers. And for the China, Japan is in a very important position, and also trading partners. So as mentioned, General Petraeus mentioned that the new Cold War, but actually it is not a Cold War because both three countries are trading mutually. So what kind of a relation should be explored for us is very important. But on the contrary, I think for China, they would like to drive a wedge between the alliance relationship between the U.S. and Japan. But I think the U.S. and Japan's alliance, solid alliance, would eventually change the China's attitude in the international liberal world order.
Thank you. So going forward in dealing with or thinking about the challenges in the region. I think one of the very common things that we see between U.S. and Japan is the increased use of the term Indo-Pacific. PACOM was renamed Indo-PACOM in May 30th. But even before that, Prime Minister Abe, even from his first term in office, has been talking about the more focus on the Indo-Pacific and the confluence of the two seas. So what do you see, first General Petraeus, is there, although President Trump mentioned Indo-Pacific, I think 10 times during his speech in November 2017, in some ways, from countries in Asia, we don't really feel the love from the U.S. to its allies either. And so what do you think is the vision of the U.S.-Japan Indo-Pacific strategy for the U.S. going forward? Or what's the meat on the bone, to it, if I can say, of the Indo-Pacific strategy that especially has to do with allies? What is the vision of the U.S. going forward?
First of all, let me just start by just noting that the Japanese military, the self-defense forces, are very, very capable. I think people can be misled by the fact that they haven't been in war and that to specifically have limits and so forth that are obviously very historic in nature. But one should not be fooled into thinking that this is not a very, very capable, highly professional, and very advanced technology force. So it's very, very significant. And China is very attuned to what Japan does. Just the transformation of one of the amphibious carriers into what could be a true aircraft carrier, albeit probably with a vertical takeoff and landing aircraft, because I can't imagine the deck's going to be long enough. But again, even that raised eyebrows and produced commentary in Beijing. So China watches Japan very clearly and carefully, and I think is very aware of the capabilities that Japan deploys, particularly at sea and in the air. Very good ground forces, but again, that is a maritime theater with air capabilities. So that's I think, number one to point out. The second is that I think it's important to observe that Prime Minister Abe, I mean, he was very astute in establishing a relationship with President Trump very early on. As I recall, he was the first one in Trump Tower to greet the president-elect. He was, I think, the first down and did one of those summits down in Mar-a-Lago. Every time I have talked to Japanese leaders, they've been very, very pleased with the relationship that they have with their U.S. counterparts. Everything that was done by Secretary Tillerson at the time, now his successor Pompeo, General McMaster, again, the relationships between the counterparts were superb. And I should note that the U.S. ambassador, with whom I have a very close relationship, and had a bit of correspondence and some phone calls recently on some other issues, actually mentioned how pleased he was. I had happened to talk to him fairly early on, and he was asking me, how do you accelerate foreign military sales, which can be a very frustrating process. And I experienced it firsthand when we were trying to build, again, the Iraqi security forces using our system, which has a lot of bureaucratic hurdles to get over. And I said, if I were in your shoes, and the incumbent in the Oval Office pretty well, I would call him and I'd say, you want him at the top to, again, the big idea, we are going to support our Japanese allies, period, and then make the Pentagon and State Department really accelerate what the normal process is. That is happening. And again, among the biggest levers that the U.S. has to get attention of North Korea, which is really by getting attention of China, through which 90% of the trade to and from the North flows, is by Japan saying that they will put in, say, the Theater High Altitude Air Defense System, or they will put in a ground version of some other, the ultimate threat that is out there is that a country which has enormous nuclear technology expertise because of the nuclear power generation that is done in Japan and is now gradually being restarted throughout the country, that could lead to something in the military realm. I'm not at all advocating that or suggesting that, but just the thought of that is enough, I think, to get attention in places to the West. And again, rest assured, I want to see all these relationships be, again, beneficial and positive for all engaged. But sometimes to get to that, you have to show that you are firm, not provocative. And I think that history is already asking if perhaps we weren't too hopeful at times in the fairly recent past and could have been firmer as certain activities were pursued that now are facts on the ground or facts at sea, in the South and East China Seas, for example, that could have been answered more decisively in the beginning and might have perhaps avoided the situation in which we now find ourselves. So now beyond that, by the way, now you see this relationship flourishing, or beginning, flourish would be an overstatement, but between the real pillars of the Indo-Pacific are India, Australia, Japan, and the other Pacific power, the United States. And so if you get those four together, and then if you could put the others around it, I think you'd have a very, very impressive group. Again, recognizing that India, of course, has a different history. It was a non-aligned, it was still buys weapons and so forth systems from Russia, in some cases, unfortunately. And so this will be a work in progress that will take some time. And there are elections coming up in India, in Australia, and at some point, I guess, in Japan as well. And hopefully we can navigate all of those reasonably well also.
So General Isobe, how about this idea of Indo-Pacific? I think the Japanese government description of the Indo-Pacific tends to focus more on the economic connectivity and not necessarily on the security aspects, aside from the capacity building and the rule-based order, which is indirectly related. So what is your take on that?
I don't know if I would agree with that if I
You
could.
think?
Just to, I mean, I actually, again, having just been in India and having just talked with the commander, who used to be commander of PACOM, U.S. PACOM, now U.S. Indo-PACOM,
Right.
and had a good chat with the admiral there and the Australian foreign minister and a number of Indians. I think there's quite a significant security component already to the Indo-Pacific concept. But I hope you would support me on that.
I think
Early days, but
my observation is that among the alliance partners in the Indo-Pacific region for the United States, Japan is increasingly important for the U.S. security because the following reasons. One is the U.S. and Japan shares the common core values like democracy, freedom of navigation, freedom of expressions. And the second is as I mentioned, Japan is situated in a very critically important position. And the third is Japan is still a number third world economy power. So I think no other countries, allies in the Indo-Pacific region can replace or substitute Japan for the United States.
oh, I agree with that very much so. And again, it would be nice to have some others in that.
Yes.
I mean, you can literally think about this, think about the first island chain, if you
Yes.
will, as it's described, and the countries that comprise it. Think about some of the countries of Southeast Asia, which were very, very vibrant. I mean, look at what's happening as low-skilled labor jobs move from China to Southeast Asia, Vietnam in particular, Thailand, a historic partner, and a number of other countries there. So there's a lot that could come together. The key, in my view, really is to have an American foreign policy to begin it that is coherent and comprehensive. Coherent means that you have... This is another project at Harvard, actually. But if you think about it, again, if the big idea is, gosh, I guess it was in, again, India, where somebody asked a question and the answerer said, China, China, China. I mean, if the most important relationship in the world, and it clearly is between the U.S. and China, clearly that has to become your priority. As you know, in the military, you can only have one main effort, and the others are all by definition, therefore, supporting efforts. So if you then, but then it has to be comprehensive, and it can't just be diplomatic or just military or just economic or just whatever. It has to be all of the above, and all of them have to be seeking to achieve the same policy objectives. And I'm not sure that in all cases that we have done that. I mean, a perfect example of this is, despite the valid concerns about some elements of the Trans-Pacific Partnership, and recognizing that both candidates ultimately, Hillary Clinton ultimately had to come out against it as well, obviously for domestic political reasons, having sold it for 4 years when I was in uniform and at the CIA. But to withdraw from that was a very, very significant step, and one that is back from the kind of coherence that you would want if you are going to confront another country whose actions in various respects have led to a bipartisan consensus in the United States writ large, not just inside the Beltway in Washington, but writ large, that there are unacceptable activities going on that need to be answered and need dialogue and need to be resolved when it comes to tariff and non-tariff trade barriers, when it comes to actions in the South China Sea, actions relative to North Korea, theft of intellectual property, forced transfer. I mean, again, there's a whole host of these. And again, I think it's now very commonly recognized. And I think, frankly, that our Chinese partners recognize that they have crossed some lines with the United States that, you know, they should have wished that they didn't do, because it has now provoked, I think, this backlash. And again, as one, we're all very active in China as well. And I'm out there several times a year, enormous admiration for what they've done. But again, this is now quite a substantial issue, and it's beyond just the sheer trade, early stages of a trade war, which presumably, many of which elements can be resolved. It's about the bigger issues that we're talking about that do have to be resolved. And again, if you're going to go at this in a coherent fashion, you want the G7 countries with you. You want NATO with you. You want all the countries, again, of Trans-Pacific Partnership with you, et cetera, et cetera. And I think we do need at times to look at, have we prioritized what it is we're doing, and are we pursuing this? And then, you know, you also have to have a little bit of a disciplined communication strategy, as we might say, as well.
Right. Yes, that discipline is very difficult, I guess, at this point in time for the
It's always
administration.
difficult.
It's always difficult.
A little bit more challenged right now.
Right. But so going forward, I'm going to sort of go into some questions that I've
Sure.
received from the audience. But there was a question raised about, to both of you, is there anything that you're worried about the U.S. Japan relationship or the alliance, if I talk about the military side of things? Because you mentioned, General Isobe, that there's a perception that there's a higher likelihood of, perception that the danger of war has gone up. I actually checked the figures, and it's gone up by 10%, from 75 to 85 in the past 3 years. And in order to deal with that, the best way to keep Japan safe, the most Japanese people still answer it's the U.S.-Japan alliance, that's 81.9%, but it's gone down slightly in the past 3 years. And whether or not the U.S.-Japan alliance is useful has gone down slightly as well. And on the other hand, what's interesting about the Chicago Council on Foreign Affairs poll that was conducted December 2018 is that despite the policy changes of the U.S. and maybe less interest in engaging abroad, the public opinion polls there show that the Americans view the U.S.-Japan relationship as an important one for the U.S. economy by 91%, and for the U.S. security at 79%. And they would actually support defending Japan against North Korean attack, 64% in its favor, but not as much for in Japan China conflict over disputed islands. So that's kind of the tricky one. But overall, so I think it's very hard to find a bilateral relationship in which the public seems to be very supportive of the alliance and the choice to rely on the alliance for its security. And having said that still, is there something, going back to this question, that worries you going forward, whether it's a gap or a difference in the preferences going forward into what the ideal situation might be, or is it more of a operational issue that has to be addressed to more effectively do things together going forward?
So, for example, in securing the defense of Japan, I think Japan should increase their defense budget. And actually, last December, this December, the government adopted the new National Defense Program guidelines. Maybe you are not so familiar with that. This is like a national defense strategy and a military strategy. Not exactly the same, but such a doctrine was adopted. And in that doctrine, the three key points is a seamless response. And the second is the whole of government approach. And in the militarily cross-domain concept. So these defense effort in Japan would eventually strengthen the alliance, because the defense of Japan improvement would help the U.S. security, national security. I think so.
So, General Petraeus, if I can
Let
plug
me
in another,
actually
yeah,
take
please.
that if I could, because
Please.
I think there are some specific issues that need to be addressed more expeditiously, frankly. One of them is in the trade area. We have trade disputes with Japan, as you well know. I mean, these date way back to the 1980s, when, you remember, there were limits. Japan instituted limits on cars. They were always way above however many actually really went anyway, but it was a wonderfully symbolic response. But there are disagreements here. We can't let this stuff divide us. And I'm reassured to a degree because the White House has alerted the Congress, notified them that they will be negotiating not just with the EU and the UK, but also with Japan, having already refined the Korea-US trade agreement, then getting agreement on the US-Mexico-Canada agreement. So I think that's actually very important, because that could, again, that could drive some wedges between our two countries. I share some of the concerns about, in a sense, the domestic sentiment about the spending on the Japanese self-defense forces. I also am very concerned, this is a long-standing concern of the last decade or more, about the U.S. base in Okinawa, which we're trying to relocate desperately. And continue to have very serious problems. This is not a trivial issue, and tragically, we've had acts of indiscipline by some of the members of the forces based there or rotating through there that have really inflamed this particular situation. And then I guess, you know, we've always been a bit concerned that Prime Minister Abe would have to deploy so much political capital to get the reinterpretation of the Constitution, or perhaps even a constitutional change, that it wouldn't leave enough for the other very important domestic issues that he has to deal with, principally those that have to do with continuing the success of Abenomics. Because if you think about it, Japan was in the doldrums for 20 years. We forget, you know, the high-flying 1980s when all of us, again, in economics courses were wondering why the U.S. didn't have a METI, the Ministry of Industry and whatever it was, an industrial policy. And we had some very sage professors at Princeton, thankfully, who said, you know, ultimately you're going to see that government bureaucrats are not going to be as good as market forces at allocating resources. And ultimately they did prove correct. So and then you had 20 years of really just stagnant growth. And Abenomics has broken through that. Would like to think that some of, you know, the U.S. investors are part of this, because we're helping to, at his request, to work on board dynamics and management philosophy and all the rest of this. So trying to retain the best features of the Japanese corporate culture while getting rid of some of those that are just holding it back. and it's been a very interesting experience in that regard. But he's got some big issues still. I mean, the debt to GDP ratio is not a trivial issue. And again, all the issues of how do you fine-tune the additional taxation without sending the economy into a tailspin? What do you do about other stimulus mechanisms? This is a very finely balanced set of policies that he's pursuing. And we're concerned that, again, you use up too much political capital here, you might not have it there, because he and his government have truly been critical to what is really an economic renaissance of Japan.
Well, I think, let me point out two points. One is that after the National Defense Program guideline, based on this, the Japanese government are going to purchase many U.S. weapon systems.
Yes,
like
you
Aegis, sure, and F-35A
Yep.
and Bs.
And by the way, these
Yeah.
get the attention of those regional
Yes.
countries.
And the second issue is the Okinawan base issues. I think the Nye Armitage report, fourth one, released last year, I think November. And they proposed that the co-location of both U.S. forces and Japanese self-defense forces located together. And it is, I think, good way to maintain the bases, facilities in Okinawa.
I hope so. Touch wood. Inshallah. As they say in my other region.
Right, inshallah. So coming back to military issues, I might as well because I have two
Sure.
generals on stage. What are, and bringing in the questions from the audience, how can the U.S. Japan cooperate to address potential threats from North Korea? And especially given that the relationship between Japan and South Korea is kind of tricky these days,
Sure.
what are the areas in which there's things that we can think about together? There was another question with regards to...
Let me actually just
yes.
start with that, because
Yes.
you never want to stack up questions with old guys. We might forget the first one. I alluded to this a bit earlier, but the effort to get North Korea to stop the missile testing, stop the nuclear testing, and then ultimately to take the other actions that can lead to, what do they call it? It's full and irreversible and verifiable denuclearization. The only way to do this was to get the attention of China. And this is why you had some of the rhetoric, not all of which would have been my choice of words at various times, but to get the attention, again, of China, that the U.S. is truly considering the use of force if North Korea doesn't come to its senses, because it's unacceptable what it was that they were doing. And at the end of the day, China has the power, if it truly implements the sanctions fully that are called for, approved by the UN Security Council, noting again that it's well over 90% of this is what keeps the lights on in Pyongyang, is the umbilical cord that runs between China and North Korea. So how else do you get China's attention? Well, you put a THAAD system, Theater High Altitude Air Defense System, into what used to be a golf course in Seoul, and that got China's attention. You put Aegis ashore. This is an air defense system that's usually on ships, but now there's a shore version of it as well. You put a THAAD system into Japan. You increase other capabilities. The F-35, the most advanced fighter bomber in the world, again, in the hands of very sophisticated professional military, in this case, pilots and airmen. That's how you get the word across that this is really something that the region, as well as the United States, are taking very, very seriously.
How about you, General Isobe, about the North Korean?
Yeah,
or the Korean Peninsula?
I think Kim Jong-un is now gaining time to continue develop nuclear weapons and ballistic missiles. So for Japan, denuclearization of Korean Peninsula is very important,
Yeah.
critical. But also for Japan, intermediate ballistic missiles threat still remains. So I believe that the extended deterrence posture provided by the U.S. is very important. And for Japan, we should strengthen or improve the credibility of the extended deterrence.
So another question, this is to General Petraeus. Over the last year or two, it looks like the U.S. Armed Forces are withdrawing from abroad. What's your view on this, and what would be the potential reaction from regional actors worldwide?
You know, until a month ago, or whenever it was that the announcement was made that we were going to withdraw from Syria and reduce our forces in Afghanistan, I would have said absolutely not true. In fact, this is my caution, particularly to overseas audiences, is always, yes, read the tweets, but then follow the troops, follow the money, and follow the policy. And so, for example, if you look at NATO, very heavily criticized by this president, by the way, also by other presidents, not quite as directly as this president has, but I've sat through NATO meetings as a NATO commander, as a 3- and 4-star, whether it was the U.S. Secretary of Defense, the U.S. presidents of both parties, again, railing on about the fact that NATO's not spending enough. And the fact is that we are spending twice what all of our NATO allies spend together. Having said that, if you then follow the troops, and you note that U.S. forces have gone into the Baltic states, there's a U.S. armor brigade back on European soil for the first time. There are U.S. fighters out in eastern Poland. There are new NATO commands being established to push the forces out there and to control the maritime approaches to Europe once again, et cetera, et cetera. Many of these, a continuation of the previous administration's policies, but frankly also an augmentation, because when you spend $720 billion on defense, your overall military readiness obviously improves dramatically, whether it's for NATO or for something in the Indo-Pacific or even in the Middle East. In fact, this administration, in its early months, decided to augment our forces in Iraq and in Syria and in Afghanistan in ways that I thought were very appropriate, were not outrageous in terms of what they were. They were very sustainable in terms of the expenditure of blood and treasure, which is necessary if you're doing something that requires a sustained commitment. Decision-making authority was pushed down to levels below those at which they were previously, and there were some of the restrictions on air power that a lot of us had questioned for some time were removed as well, noting again that the previous administration made steps in that regard as well. And again, then you look at what was done in the Pacific region, again, largely a continuation of what the previous administration did with the so-called rebalance to Asia, or the, quote, popularly known as the pivot to Asia, which none of us like, because a pivot implies you're pivoting away from something else, from the Middle East to the East Asia, whereas really you're staying engaged here and you're just getting further engaged there. So I would have actually countered that until these recent announcements. The challenge now is we really don't have clarity on what the true policy is in Syria. The policy objectives, which we thought were clear when enunciated by National Security Advisor Bolton and Ambassador Jeffrey, the special envoy for Syria and now also for the counter-ISIS coalition. We have to see what they are going to be if they're redefined, and what will the pace of the drawdown be, and on and on and on. And then, does it make sense? How can you square a circle if in Afghanistan you already have a fraught security situation, and if you acknowledge that we went there for a reason? It's where the 9/11 attacks were planned. When Al-Qaeda had a sanctuary under the Taliban, we stayed for a reason to ensure that it stays eliminated. And we've now done it in a way that, again, I would contend is sustainable, which is crucial, and by the way, involves a very substantial level of assistance from Japan, which again, I'm certain is probably still the number 2 contributor to the financial assistance for our Afghan partners.
So I think we have time for one last question, which should be to both of you. Some have argued that Japan should be included in the Five Eyes, which is intelligence sharing, which is at this point U.S., U.K., Australia, Canada, New Zealand. What are the challenges for Japan to be a member, and what is your view from the U.S. side about potentially putting Japan included?
Well, Five Eyes, if Japan is welcomed to the Five Eyes countries, members, I think we should have a much more secured information protection measures. Yeah.
How about you, General?
Well, I think it's very clear. I mean, again, there are very significant technical standards that have to be applied. I think the general would probably acknowledge that China has prided itself on its openness, not its closedness. And when you are sharing very sensitive information about sources, i.e. human beings, or what is it derived from them, and methods, particularly, again, in a variety of different technical realms of signals and cyber and space and so forth, you've got to be sure that the handling measures are absolutely routine for that organization. I'm not saying that there is not classified information in the Japanese system. I am saying I think it's accurate because you've seen both systems, and undoubtedly I'm sure you were given at least a U.S. secret clearance at some of your times in the U.S., that there are not quite the same procedural aspects to the safeguarding of classified information. But again, I ask for your confirmation or denial. Thank you.
Well, so I guess on a very military note, that might be appropriate, but I'm very happy that we actually talked about a much wider range of issues than maybe the audience might have expected from two generals on stage, so I have to thank you for that. Please join me in thanking General Petraeus and General Isobe.
Thank you. Thank you. First asked to do this by the Consul General, I don't know, years ago, I think, and it took quite some time to finally get it scheduled. But the reason I did it and agreed to it back then and obviously showed up here tonight is because of my enormous respect for him and for what Japan did, not just in Afghanistan, but also in Iraq and a variety of other places around the world. And we were very grateful for the strength of this relationship.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.